Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see a nice crowd. Welcome to Ream Library. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at Holy Cross. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of conferences, lectures, special events that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can find a schedule of our events and video of past events, including in a couple days of this event, online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Today I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Nikhil Singh to Holy Cross. I know that a number of my faculty colleagues here engage his work with their students, Professor Fritz and Eggemeyer among those, as many of you students will know, including this semester, so it's great to have him here in person to speak to us. Nikhil Pal Singh is Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History and Chair of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. He's here today for a two-timely talk titled, How Did War Become Permanent? At NYU, Professor Singh works at the intersection of contemporary U.S. history and political theory with a focus on race, empire, and culture in the 20th century U.S., Black radicalism and U.S. liberalism, and U.S. foreign policy. Along with several social and cultural analysis faculty colleagues and former PhD students, Professor Singh helped create and develop the NYU Prison Education Program, serving as its founding faculty director from 2014 to 2023. During that time, he participated in raising millions of dollars in foundation and government grants and private donations to sustain and grow the prison education program. Before joining the faculty at NYU, Professor Singh served as the Walker Family Professor of History at the University of Washington. He worked closely with legendary Black freedom movement activist Jack Odell, gathering, editing, and introducing Odell's collected essays and movement writings in Kleiman Jacobs' Ladder, published by the University of California Press in 2010. Professor Singh's first book, Black is a Country, Race and the Unfinished Struggle for Democracy, was recognized after its 2004 release as the best book on U.S. civil rights history by the Organization of American Historians. His second book, Race and America's Long War, is a powerful examination of the relationship between race, war, and policing in U.S. domestic life and overseas conflict. Reconstructing Democracy, a collection of essays on the U.S. Black intellectual history, is forthcoming by him from the University of California Press. I'm eager to hear more about the connections Professor Singh will draw between his scholarship and the current state of permanent war, so please join me in welcoming Nikhil Singh.
Okay, good afternoon. Nice to see you all. I know that many of you are a captive audience here, so I'll try to make this interesting for you. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm going to try to keep my time. And I'll say that this piece is a piece that I've been working on with Professor Thuy Linh Tu, who is someone I've been writing with and working on some essays with for the last few years. And we started writing this essay in 2020, right after the murder of George Floyd and the protest movement that erupted after those events in Minneapolis in 2020. Of course, they were preceded by a long period of protest and kind of anguish around police violence in the United States. I realize that 4 years in the life of an undergraduate is like a lifetime. So even 4 years ago may be a distant memory to all of you. I don't know, but I'm curious to hear when I finish talking what thoughts you might have and whether this resonates for you. So let me kind of jump in and just start with a few kind of introductory thoughts before I kind of move into the more formal part of the talk. So one of the things I've been thinking about over the last several years is the relationship between internal coercion and violence inside the United States and U.S. war making overseas. So we might think of this under the heading of policing and war. and how these phenomena become mutually reinforcing or get braided together in kind of everyday social life and social practice in terms of the personnel who are involved in these projects, and then in terms of the ways in which the dispositions that are formed in warfare against people who are considered to be enemy populations become internalized in the way in which the United States comes to act upon and treat its own residents and citizens. Okay? So in other words, the way war has a tendency to kind of boomerang back to the United States. Now, this boomerang metaphor is something that has been used by a bunch of thinkers over the last 100 years to think about the way colonialism works, that colonialism overseas has a way of corrupting the societies that engage in those practices. And when I started thinking about this in relationship to the United States, I realized that the story is actually more complicated because the United States itself begins as a colonial project. It begins with the dispossession of indigenous land. It begins with the enslavement of captive African populations who are brought to the United States at its founding, at its origin, right? So this internal coercion of populations that are in some ways inside the polity but are seen as exterior to it is actually just coded into our history from the beginning. So there's something about the way in which it's not just a boomerang that comes back, but it's something that's tossed out, comes back, tossed out, that comes back, tossed out, that comes back, and so forth. I'm not the first person to think of these ideas. So I kind of have these three quotes, and they kind of come from different places. Charles Sloan was one of the first American policemen to be sent to Saigon in the mid-1950s when the United States began intervening in the Vietnam War that the French were fighting to try to retain their colony. This is before the Americans take over the war in the 1960s. But Sloan goes over there to basically build up the indigenous police force, thinking that this is going to stop the North Vietnamese communist insurgency from taking over the country. But in the 1950s, Sloan wrote an essay about the use of police dogs in police work. So it's just kind of the specialist technical essay. And I pulled out this passage because I think the passage really indicates something about the point of view that a policing professional in the United States had in the 1950s. And it's a point of view that actually extends quite a bit beyond this period. So this is what Sloan says. He says, if you give some thought to the subject, there is but little difference between fighting an enemy in a declared war and fighting an enemy, the criminal, at home on the crime front. Both are comparable battles for the very existence of civilization, for without the thin wall of police protecting the people from criminal depredation, the world would soon revert to savagery and bestiality. I mean, that's pretty, dramatic. And to imagine, really, that that's what policing is supposed to be. And in an essay where he's thinking about how police have historically used dogs to do things like track down runaway slaves or to police the frontier or the border. So Sloan is already thinking about policing in this kind of colonial idiom, is what I'm saying. So this sort of integration of policing and war is already there at the start. Now, in the 1960s, black activists who were very kind of beginning to sort of mount a serious campaign for racial equality, which obviously goes back to the same period, the middle of the 1950s and even earlier, but this movement is really accelerating in the 1960s, begin to argue that policing is kind of one of the front lines of racial oppression. And Jack O'Dell, who was mentioned in the introduction, was a black activist who worked very closely with Dr. King. He later worked with Jesse Jackson. He had a long career in the Black freedom movement. And he wrote an essay in the 1960s called The July Rebellions in the Military State. And in that essay, he really lays out in this very pithy way this trajectory that I'm thinking of when I embark on the work that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. The road which leads from the Indian massacres of the last century to the Pentagon and another from the oppressive slave plantation to the ghetto are the major conjunctive highways running through the very center of U.S. life and history. So when we take an idea like that, we recognize that even though we're talking about contemporary history, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today as I pick up on the events surrounding the murder of George Floyd, we are talking about a long historical arc. And one of the things we have to keep in mind in thinking about some of these questions is how history informs the present, how we live in a kind of the present past. It's not to say that we're completely constrained by what happened in the past, but the past is a kind of shadow, right? It's a kind of weight. It weighs on our present in ways that we are often trying to account for and figure out. That's what Jack O'Dell was pointing to. And then lastly, an academic writing in the early 1970s about the metastatic growth of the United States military apparatus, which is something that had developed especially from the period since World War II, now is the largest military in the world, employs 3.2 million people, has 800 military bases all over the world, is the largest discretionary spending in the federal budget. We have a massive military complex. In the 1970s, social scientists began to study this and think about this. Adam Yarmolinsky, who had been in the Johnson administration during the Vietnam War, wrote a book called The Military Establishment. It's a massive book. You should go and read it. People don't read old books sometimes, but sometimes these old books actually show us that there's nothing new under the sun. We academics always think we're inventing something new every time, and then you go back and realize that someone had actually written about this in a really interesting way if we sort of go and see what they had to say. So what Yarmolinsky said in the early 1970s after he had left the government and gone back to academia was the use of techniques applied in foreign wars and planning for future wars may lead to increased likelihood that certain groups in American society will gradually be regarded as an enemy with action appropriate to that perception, insensitivity to unwarranted police violence, and insensitivity to the brutality in military action abroad and at home may be unrelated phenomena, but they cannot escape mutual reinforcement. So in a way, what Yarmolinsky is saying there is exactly where I started, this kind of braiding together. Note how academics tend to write in a way that complicates things and makes them less easily decipherable than, say, the activist quotation right above it, which sort of lays it out really clearly. Conjunctive highways running through the very center of American life and history. But Yarmolinsky's trying to be careful, and he's saying these may be related. He's not totally sure how they're related. And he's worried that people are going to say, well, this isn't serious work because it's trying to make connections that we can't really prove, right? And academics are supposed to have proof and evidence and show all the connections, right? So I'm not saying that I can always prove all of this. So what I'm going to talk to you about today has some impressionistic qualities to it. But what I want to do is I want to go to the scene, really, of George Floyd's murder, where it begins. And I want to read that scene to you with a different kind of lens. I want to read that scene to you from the lens that tries to think about the relationship between the inner war and the outer war, between this kind of boomerang of history, this arc that runs from the slave plantation to the ghetto, from the frontier to the Pentagon, and to think about how we still live in a world, and especially in the United States, in which these kind of magnetic poles are constraining our society and constraining our ability to think and live otherwise, to use resources differently, to imagine a world that is not organized around war, but that is organized around a different kind of idea of development. Okay, so that was a kind of a long introduction. I realize that I just already spoke for about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep the rest of it on time, but I might go a little bit over. And I'm going to start here. In the video that launched 1,000 protests, a young black man, George Floyd, is shown slowly expiring under the knee of a police officer, Derek Chauvin. As another Minneapolis police force member, Tu Tao, stands by. Tao is holding off the gathering crowd as they beg Chauvin to stop, his body marking the boundary between the violence and its witness. At any time, it seems, he might hop over the invisible line and join the anxious onlookers. Tao later admitted that he had heard the public's pleas to intervene, but that the three officers who pinned the handcuffed Floyd face down on the asphalt surface were following protocol. He attested to his first-hand knowledge of the procedure. Due to his small stature, he said, he had been used as an example of things in training exercises. When the 9-minute video of Floyd's killing went viral, the small group that Tao held back exploded into a wave of marches, occupations, rioting, looting, blockades, even attacks on police precincts. A dramatic break from the months of pandemic confinement and culmination of a decade of collective politics that had grown up under the banner Black Lives Matter, the Floyd uprising was by some measures the largest, most concentrated, and costliest wave of civil unrest in United States history. The protests put the central paradox of policing in a democracy into high relief. Policing is widely accepted as necessary for the protection of ordinary citizens from criminal depredation and the prevention of society's dissolution into a war of all against all. You see that in the quotation I read from Charles Sloan. And yet, routine policing operations and protocols consistently discriminate against the poor and socially marginalized and confirm the existence of an arbitrary, violent, and unaccountable force. We learned from the trials of the 4 police officers who beat Rodney King in 1992 that the unofficial phrase of the LAPD that they used to describe their own violence against young and unemployed black men in particular was, quote, "no humans involved." So that was in the unofficial discourse of the LAPD. NHI, no humans involved. This was a police encounter, no humans involved. The term exemplifies how police power in the United States developed as a kind of governmental power that does not appear to require or recognize a body politic. Neither Floyd nor the protesters that day had any standing in its eyes. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the foremost black intellectuals in U.S. history, once put it succinctly. For black people, Du Bois wrote, "the police are our government." Following slavery, Du Bois argued, free black communities were subjected to rule by direct and coercive force rather than by means of their democratic consent and participation. Criminal sanction was also historically a cornerstone of the invalidation of autonomous indigenous resistance. Since then, Native Americans have, like African Americans, suffered disproportionate levels of police violence. According to CDC data, Native Americans are most likely to die at the hands of the police. And a study of more than 5 million police encounters in New York City found that U.S. police report that they are 53% more likely to use force against black criminal suspects. And a large national data set records black civilians 350% more likely to experience physical abuse at the hands of the police. Now, when I quote these statistics, what I'm suggesting here is something that you should be aware of. A lot of people have disputed this idea that African Americans are more frequently killed than non-African Americans by the police, and that's actually true. There isn't a huge variation in, the US police kill about 1,000 people a year, and it's actually fairly distributed in terms of the representation of the population. But where the statistics really begin to shift is in the use of police force and violence. There's a tremendous disparity in police use of force when it comes to people of color and indigenous African American people in particular. Gosh, I'm only on page 1. The racially disproportionate use of violence by the police not only challenges their legitimacy, but also raises questions about the anti-civic foundation of U.S. policing as an institution. From Chicago in 1919 to Watts in 1965 to Ferguson in 2012, police violence has been the spark for major episodes of social unrest and movement organizing. The aftermath of the Watts riot marked the intensification of urban black militancy, including the emergence of the Black Panther Party. Police brutality against Indians living in the Twin Cities spurred the creation of the American Indian Movement in 1968, leading to a 71-day siege at Wounded Knee across the state line in South Dakota. In the face of these challenges, the militarization of policing proceeded apace, from the police bombing of the MOVE organization in Philadelphia in 1985 to the mobilization of the National Guard in 1992 in LA, to the use of tear gas, concussion grenades, and water cannons to clear the pipeline protesters at Standing Rock in 2016. That, again, goes to this long arc, these major conjunctive highways. Though we live in the aftermath of the age of slavery, Indian removal, and Jim Crow, a contention of the Floyd protests is that contemporary U.S. policing emerges from and is continuous with these histories. It is also extended beyond them. As the U.S. expanded its global reach after World War II, police power metastasized, becoming the face of government for the poor, segregated, and colonized across the world, from Saigon to Baghdad and Kabul, from New Orleans to Standing Rock and Minneapolis. U.S. police power persistently functions to adjudicate, to judge between those who are included in a lawful democratic process and those who are bound but not protected by the law. It is, in other words, both an instrument tied to a history of frontier violence and anti-black racism, and a mechanism for sorting human beings across America's wider imperium. We see the traces of these global histories of race, migration, policing, and war at the scene of Floyd's death. Established 30 years ago by Palestinian immigrants to the United States, Cup Foods, shown in this slide here, oops, what's happening? Cup Foods is right here in the bottom corner. The convenience store where Floyd had passed the counterfeit $20 bill that led to the police being called had been cited by the police many times over the years for failing to report loitering and drug-related activity in its vicinity. The teenage clerk at the cash register that day, a West African immigrant, was unaware of what Cup's owners had learned from bitter experience. It was sometimes better not to call the police. Also at the scene, of course, was Tu Tao, a Hmong American police officer whose career had been littered with disciplinary complaints, including for brutalizing a young black man, Lamar Ferguson, resulting in a lawsuit that the city had settled for $25,000. The complexity of these encounters, and Tu Tao's presence in particular, has largely dissolved. Less flesh than phantasm, much about this other cop charged with aiding and abetting murder remains unknown to us. What would we see if we lingered on this quietly disappearing figure a bit? Not to exonerate or excuse him, to judge him same or different from George Floyd, but to consider how he might have found himself serving as a human traffic cone, as his attorney characterized it that spring day, to ask how the violence of war and policing and the racial and economic order they shape and sustain is constituted and reproduced, to consider those often overlooked aspects of American police power, no less integral to Floyd's fate, but requiring us to journey beyond America's domestic history of anti-black racism to its global and imperial history. So what I'm doing here in this piece is setting up Tao and Floyd as two counterparts of this history of the inner and the outer war. Not to say that one is guilty and one is innocent, specifically. I mean, you could say that one is guilty and one is innocent, and certainly Tao would be judged guilty, and Floyd himself did not live from the encounter. So we know that in some sense Floyd was innocent, a victim of violence. But if we set up the frame and think of it differently, right, and think of these figures and how they come together, it opens up a kind of a wider lens from which we can examine this event that has kind of been construed very, very narrowly through kind of the history of the United States and the specific racial history of the United States, but that has these kind of wider coordinates. Now, the reason it took us so long to write this piece is because it was very hard to say this right after the event. It was very hard to kind of pull back from the event and kind of try to think what we would learn from it or what we could learn from it if we took a kind of a wider view. Now, it is in some ways still impossible to see Tao and what he might represent. His body is there, but you can't see the streets where he walked, the McDonald's where he worked before he became a police officer, the community college where he took classes before dropping out, the Minneapolis he made home. At his federal trial for violating George Floyd's civil rights, Tao recalled childhood encounters with the Minneapolis police when he was 7 or 8, when they were called in to arrest his father for domestic violence, including a threat to kill the entire family. Tao described the time his father spent in police custody as the most peaceful days of his young life, perhaps even marking the beginning of his own interest in becoming a police officer. Did he too see the police as the face of government? Emptied of his own history, it is difficult to see what placed Tao at the crossroads of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue on that fateful afternoon. To map his presence, we have to look not in the immediacy of the video or even in Minneapolis, but in the mountainous lands and fiercely independent communities of Laos, which had been identified first by the French and then the Americans as resources and tools to preserve privileged access to the trade of Southeast Asia. Like many Southeast Asians, the Hmong people were pulled into the United States through the bloody crucibles of colonialism and counterinsurgency. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States ran 58,000 bombing missions over Laos, one every 8 minutes, every day for 9 years. As many Hmong died in the US wars in Southeast Asia as Americans, along with millions of Vietnamese and Cambodians. Those missions were labeled police actions by the US government, officers and ordinary soldiers that prosecuted them. The moniker police gave a less formal, more elastic and discretionary character to these interventions than war. So one of the questions is, why did they call it police action and not war, right? That's something to think about. When does the word police come in and when does the word war come in? One of the things that I'm trying to suggest here is that these terms become, again, very braided together, and that police becomes used to describe something that people want more latitude. They want to imagine it as something that is not war or short of war, even though it has all the characteristics of war. So, after World War II, police action was a way of reanimating what an older colonial tradition had called small wars, including, often paradigmatically, America's own Indian wars, even when such wars, such as those in Southeast Asia, rained down death and destruction on catastrophic scales. These slides are just kind of backdrop to what I'm saying. You know, they're meant to be impressionistic, and they kind of gather together some of the, the resources that I've pulled together in the research that I've done, kind of spanning these works from Christopher Caldwell's Caldwell's Small Wars, which was written in 1899 to sort of think about the wars of the British Empire, to the ways in which that got translated into American discourses. So there's the Small Wars Manual that the US Marine Corps produces in the 1940s. And after World War II, small wars begin to be redescribed as police action and counterinsurgency. It was in the Philippines during the first overseas U.S. counterinsurgency effort of the 20th century that U.S. military intelligence made great leaps forward in learning how to fight wars by other names. There, the U.S. military fashioned what historian Alfred McCoy has described as a laboratory of police modernity. By the 1960s, the Kennedy administration had centralized U.S. policing, police training, and police action as a global strategy for managing decolonization. Years before American soldiers landed in Da Nang in 1965 to fight a ground war, U.S. policing professionals, corrections officials, and ordinary cops had been sent to instruct weaker neighbors and defeated enemies from Japan to the Philippines to Brazil and South Vietnam in order to effect what the Kennedy administration overseas internal defense policy called the immunization of vulnerable societies against insurgency. In both theory and practice, these counterinsurgency techniques migrated back to the United States. That's the boomerang that I talked about earlier. They were taken up by people like Daryl Gates, who rose to prominence as chief of one of the nation's largest and most violent urban police forces in Los Angeles. Gates recalled that at the end of the 1960s, he and a few of his fellow patrolmen, quote, began reading everything we could get our hands on concerning counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare. Now, why would American policemen begin reading everything they could get their hands on about counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare starting in the 1960s? As the protests of the 1960s spilled out onto the streets, cities like his own began to look to Gates like what he called foreign territory, like the war zones that demanded concerted and, when necessary, exceptional measures to combat. And again, black activists like Samuel Yet took the opposite perspective. In the ghettos, as in Southeast Asia, the need for pacification rises out of a history of colonization, the economic and cultural exploitation of a subject group, an honest determination to relinquish such exploitation would obviate the need to pacify. So you can think of these as counterpoints. We embrace this history in order to change its course, or we embrace this history to basically say, what we have to do overseas, now we have to do it at home. That there actually is no distinction between the inner and the outer war. That on both fronts, we're fighting an incorrigible enemy. And that perspective of an incorrigible enemy at home and an incorrigible enemy overseas, you know what the word incorrigible means, right? It means unchangeable, unreformable. That begins to sink into the very logic of American policing. And Gates's own words confirm this. This is something that he was not ashamed to put in his own autobiography written in the 1990s. The very year that Rodney King's beating by LA cops set off one of the worst riots in American urban history in Los Angeles, that then demanded the calling in of the National Guard. The same year that the United States is also fighting the first Gulf War in Iraq. How do we continually find ourselves in this country in this kind of a situation? There's a war over there, there's a sense of a war over here. How do these inner and outer wars continue to sort of, again, recur, metastasize, come into relationship with one another? Again, I think we have to look to this long arc of history, but then we also have to think about how these institutions basically come to kind of interpenetrate in their logics, rationales, strategies, tactics, and personnel. Now, Daryl Gates may have first learned the lesson about guerrilla warfare from reading the works of people like Charles Sloan, who picked it up on their tours of duty. John Burge, an ordinary police officer, an ordinary soldier, and hardly exceptional in making the transition from the US military to the municipal police, ended his second tour of duty in Vietnam in 1969 and returned home to Chicago to join its police force in the early 1970s. Burge had served in Dong Tam, south of Saigon, overseeing a detention camp where prisoners of war, usually local villagers, were routinely tortured with electric shocks generated via exposed wires from field telephones. In Chicago, Burge ran a notorious police unit that tortured hundreds of black criminal suspects across several decades. Their preferred method was a black box with exposed wires attached to extremities, including the genitals of detainees, with a crank to generate electric shocks. You may have read about this case. This case was only really resolved just in the years leading up to the events of 2020, when Burge was finally brought to justice in Chicago after having done this for 2 decades. Hundreds of men who were criminal suspects were tortured in what were effectively black sites in Chicago. These are not conspiracy theories. These were police practices. Now, these were rogue police in a sense. They were definitely not operating according to the rules that they were supposed to be following. But they were able to do so with impunity for many years. And the point of this story partly is to, again, to connect it back to where Burge learned the very techniques he started using in Chicago, which was in the field in Saigon, where he was a military policeman. The history of U.S. counterinsurgency tells us that policing is warfare by other names. The two are inseparable, reproducing each other through material exchange and racial logic. Seen through the eyes of the cops who learned to torture black men by practicing on Southeast Asian civilians, Tao and Floyd might not even have looked so different. Remember, the first thing that Tao said when he was interviewed was like, I was used in the training experiments because I was so small and I was seen as kind of somebody that they could, of course, Floyd was not small. But he was like, I was used in the training exercise. And so I knew that I needed to just stand aside and not act. But they may indeed have been similarly situated by a police power that sorts populations into those requiring protection and those to be protected against. If the death of George Floyd reminds us how anti-blackness continues to animate this system, the figure of Tu Tao might help us to see how the world's poor and disfranchised are continually pulled in and ground up by its ever-expanding machinery. Immediately following the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the U.S. launched its initial efforts to circumvent the Geneva Conventions and bolster anti-communist South Vietnam. By 1961, the CIA was prosecuting a secret war in Laos in an effort to destabilize the North Vietnamese. The brainchild of counterinsurgency specialist U.S. Colonel Edward Lansdale, thousands of Vietnamese, Filipinos, Koreans, and later Hmong were drawn into the vortex of a 20-year U.S. military intervention as soldiers, spies, cooks, medics, porters, cleaners, drivers, and sex workers. In a terrain dominated by more powerful forces, the Hmong people in particular were left with few good choices about how to define their allegiances. Despite supporting the U.S. at war's end, many Hmong were abandoned and left stateless by their former ally. Without any formal recognition or even widespread knowledge of their involvement in these clandestine operations, they had little access to international support and were deemed initially too primitive to be offered asylum in the United States. Displaced Hmong flowed through the camps in Thailand, some with plans to return to Laos, others with hopes of being placed in what US officials called an Indian reservation or Eskimo area, if they had to be sent somewhere, all waiting on an uncertain future. The US government eventually reversed their position, thanks in part to African American civil rights activists like Bayard Rustin, who was among their most forceful advocates. A series of refugee acts followed, which allowed some Hmong to enter the US, but also dispersed them across the country in the hopes that they would quickly assimilate. Tens of thousands of Hmong eventually landed in Minnesota, many through secondary migration from even less hospitable locations. Some came after facing violence from unwelcoming neighbors in small towns, including from returning soldiers diagnosed with PTSD. Some remigrated after experiencing acute isolation in the hopes of reconstituting a sense of community. Hmong communities were formed in the brutal crucible of post-Vietnam War America. Tao himself struggled in school and cycled through a series of low-wage jobs. Like many others in that position, he saw the police force as an opportunity. Since at least the 1960s, when urban police forces began recruiting black officers, in part to stem accusations of racism, men and women of all racial, ethnic, and class backgrounds have regaled themselves in blue. It has been a point of some pride to police professionals and military leadership that their organizations have long been integrated. The job is a pretty good one: decent pay, overtime, health insurance, early retirement. For people like Tao with few educational and financial resources, it might have been the best one in town. It might have also been the one that made sense. Growing up with domestic violence, policing had been part of Tao's personal life. It was also a feature of his community history. The Hmong people were both subjected to and collaborators in US police actions abroad. When the doors of immigration opened, it was also the institution of American policing that gave them and many other Southeast Asian refugees a rare opportunity for economic and social stability. For Hmong community members with long memories and national pride, policing was in many ways a natural fit. Chai Nu Lee, the highest-ranking Hmong police officer in Minnesota, explained to the New York Times that his own choice to become a police officer extends from the older community back in Laos. Inspector Lee said his father had fought alongside the Americans, a role he was proud of, so the career choice of a police officer seemed natural. Lee's experience is not uncommon. Men like Lee's father, who had demonstrated connection to the US military, had been moved to the front of the line for relocation to the US. Flexibly applying parole authority, US officials replaced normal requirements and procedures for immigration with an intricate point system favoring former soldiers. We gave points for everything from length of service to whether somebody had been wounded to the kind of service they performed. Thousands of former soldiers and their families found their way into the US through parole authority. If this selective presence was a kind of payment for their participation in the US past wars, it was also a kind of credit to be used for future wars. Given the centrality of the US security state in shaping Hmong life and labor in Minnesota and beyond, it's not hard to imagine how Tu Tao could have found himself donning a blue uniform. By the time he joined the force, police power had come to be understood as indispensable, if sometimes heartbreaking, necessary as a response to a variety of social exigencies, whether the need to civilize indigenous presence, capture runaway slaves, reform recalcitrant workers, or punish restive colonials. With no end in sight to the expansiveness of this power, it can seem like the only option left is to remain on the right side of the machinery, to become the police rather than the punished. Perhaps this is how the other cop, Tu Tao, saw it as he watched the crowds encircle George Floyd and George Floyd's body collapse. His own feet remained stuck at the boundary line. Perhaps this is how most of us see it. In recent decades, security has become an organizing structure in many American lives. By some estimates, an astonishing 1 in 4 Americans work in protective services, either as police, corrections officers, or security guards, numbers that have risen with a stagnant economy and growing wealth inequality. This figure does not include work for the U.S. Department of Defense, its 3.2 million workers, making it the single largest employer in the world. All the actors in this particular drama have taken up this form of labor. Tao was a guard at a department store. Even Floyd found work in security at a nightclub, the same job, same place, where Derek Chauvin had earned extra pay during his off-duty hours. Today, one of the first signs that greets a visitor to upstate prisons in New York State, where I've done some work, and probably many other states, is a folded framed flag dedicated to the corrections officials who served in Operation Iraqi Freedom, which includes those at Baghdad's notorious Abu Ghraib prison. The revolving door between civilian and military policing is no small matter in a country whose permanent war footing over these past decades metastasized alongside an unprecedented, cruel, and starkly racialized system of criminal policing and mass incarceration. Indeed, Derek Chauvin himself joined the Minneapolis Police Department immediately following the second of 2 4-year stints in the Army Reserve Military Police. The jail, the prison, the police station, and the military base form a landscape of so much of contemporary life for poor communities in the U.S. These institutions are the poles around which Tao, Floyd, and so many others have circulated, enacting and subjected to various forms of cruelty. After a century of expansion, it is not hard to encounter the police now. 77 million American adults have a criminal arrest record. 77 million American adults in a country of a population of where I think there are probably about 250 million adults. So it's a huge number of people who have had police involvement. Many of you may have had family members with police involvement. Many of you may have family members who are police. I mean, part of my point here is not to distinguish between the police and the police involved. It's to actually suggest something about the machinery that comes to encompass our social life, comes to dominate and kind of saturate the way we learn to organize our concept of what security is supposed to look like. But it leaves us actually quite insecure for the most part. There's no straight line from Laos to Lake Street, but it is difficult to fully grasp the economic deprivation and racial subjugation that led to George Floyd's death without understanding how traces of the colonial past also shaped the landscape of his murder. Lingering on the figure of Tu Tao, I hope, has helped us to capture some of those traces. We can see glimpses of them in that video image of Tao. In some shots, his body is a jumble with the other 3 cops. In others, he is cut off, framed alongside the growing crowd. But viewed from the long frame of war and displacement, Tao's body begins to look less like a boundary, a dividing line between life and death, sin and sorrow, between George Floyd's murder and the encroaching crowd. It appears instead as a bleeding edge where all that came before converged, spilling out, reminding us that this site of racial violence is also a scene of U.S. empire. Now, my conclusion, this violence of the past does not magically rise. It is consciously maintained, exhumed by policy, including sometimes reformist policy. Robert F. Kennedy, great aspirant for the presidency, himself murdered in 1968, called counterinsurgency armed social work. He thought it was doing good. But armed social work soon turned to torturing people who did not comply. So it suggests something flawed in the very conception, right? In the very conception that organized it. And I think you're talking about that in your class when you're thinking about this kind of lingering way in which just war sort of organizes the way in which we think about the use of coercive force. Allegedly more careful and legitimate uses of force and calibrated non-lethal thresholds of violence are constantly being advanced to innovate new methods and pretexts to widen the purview of policing. Even those disorders that result from the failures and excesses of policing now tend to be answered with calls for more and better policing. But if we really want to understand and address the authoritarian tendencies of the US state in the contemporary era, we need to see policing as a preeminently colonial institution that has carried and knitted together US imperial and racial history, drawing a line between those who are governed by their consent and those who must be governed by force. Policing is the method by which a specific form of power was elaborated in relationship to racialized and colonized subjects and then spread to a broader social field. Tao's ambiguous positioning alerts us to the ways police power actually hinges between arrest and development, subjection and citizenship, how it invites us in and grinds us down, how it joins those who are internally excluded within a democratic society to those overseas who have been caught in a web of military interventions. Tao and Floyd faced each other on opposite sides of the thin blue line, one the perpetrator and the other one the victim. But the operation of this power extends far beyond the badge and gun held by Tao. It is a force infusing the lives of those excluded from within a democracy and those excluded from without, those denied entry and those subjected to disruptive and violent intervention. In short, all those who encounter the police as the face of government. So I'll stop there. I didn't do too badly with the time. And take your questions and comments. Thank you. There's a lot to say about this topic, and it's a tricky one, because we've been living through the last few years with this question of what to do about policing, but also, everybody also thinks about what to do about crime, what to do about disorder, what to do about the stress on the streets. It's not like an easy problem to solve. And of course, there's a massive war being waged right now in the Middle East, in Israel and Gaza, which is terribly one-sided and brutal, which the US is supplying almost all the arms for, and a lot of the moral cover for in world arenas. And there are big questions about how to think about that, because that's clearly being prosecuted as a just war. But many see it now as a terribly unjust one. So what to do about that? How to think through these cycles and circuits of war that renew war. One of the things that US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara said during the Vietnam War, which I've always thought was one of the most chilling things he ever said, and he was a very, very smart man, and McNamara got a start at Ford Motor Company. One of his great innovations was the innovation of the seatbelt. He was interested in saving lives. He went on to become defense secretary. He's a very high-minded guy. Later on, he became the president of the World Bank. So he had this kind of trajectory that goes from Ford Motor Company to the Pentagon to the World Bank. And in many ways, single-handedly responsible, not single-handedly, but one of the most responsible members of an administration that prosecuted a war in Southeast Asia that killed 2 to 3 million people. Like a staggering genocidal war. I don't think there's any doubt about that when we talk about the Vietnam War. And what McNamara said during that war, when the US students mostly started protesting it in great numbers and disrupting our society to stop it, what he said was, well, it's not going so well, but the one thing that's doing for us is it's teaching us how to fight the wars of the future. Chilling, right? I mean, it's kind of like there is this idea of a machinery that has to be kept going. We have to keep oiling it up. We have to keep developing new weapon systems, new strategies, new techniques. A lot of creative intelligence goes into this field, right? There's a lot of employment opportunities in this field, as I've told you about, right? Sometimes it's actually hard to refuse it. Because also there's a morality that goes with it that says, this is just, this is good. We're here to save lives, we're here to protect people. How does it all go so wrong every single time? and yet we never stop doing it differently, it seems. This is the hard problem that you're tackling and that you're wrestling with this semester. So I applaud you for it. You know, it's not an easy problem. And I have friends in the military and I have friends in the police. And that's why I wrote this paper in the way that I did, and this is why it was hard to write and hard to publish right after what happened to George Floyd, because part of what we wanted to say was, you know, this isn't simply about victims and victimizers. This is actually about the way a society has been organized. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture and for your work. I think what I'm curious to hear you talk about, and you were starting, I think, at the end of that comment to get at it, is you had said in your lecture, and we all know, that people see police and police presence as something that's necessary for the safety of communities. Mm-hmm. These people tend not to be familiar with the type of history that you've presented here and that you present elsewhere in your work. So how do you begin a conversation to those who aren't, or with those who aren't a captive audience in a college classroom or the Ream Library? I mean, people who you would hope could be convinced or swayed a little bit that our safety is necessary, but maybe not necessarily massive police presence, and certainly not militarized police presence. So how do you kind of start that conversation?
Thank you. It's a good question. I remember, like, the first time that one of the first times I heard Jesse Jackson speak when I was in grad school. And it was in the late 1980s, and he was still running for president back then. And, you know, Jesse's a complicated figure, and he has his flaws. But one of the things he said then, and I was a student then, he said, you know, and I was doing my graduate degree at Yale, so we were in New Haven, very poor city, heavily incarcerated, heavily policed, also a lot of violent crime. And, you know, he pointed out to us that it cost the same amount of money to go to Yale for a year as it did to incarcerate someone in one of Connecticut's state prisons. And I was staggered by this. It seems like such an obvious thing, but I was like, really? Like, and then I researched it a little, and it turns out that it's actually true. It is enormously expensive to incarcerate people. We spend a huge amount of money on policing and on punishment and on the apparatus that sort of, all the ancillary sort of apparatus that develops around it. I think this is kind of where the discourse of defund the police came from, but it kind of went off the rails a little bit because it wasn't like just defund the police. I mean, the real argument was, how do you think about the use of societal resources? And could societal resources be used in a way that would actually obviate or eliminate the need for this extensive level of policing and punishment? Could there be a way? I think if you start from that question, you know, the people who will say no, there's no other way, are the people who want to argue that there are just incorrigible criminal populations. If you think that people are just incorrigible, again, that word's a really important word, I think. People are unchangeable, and they're just criminal, and they're just going to behave this way no matter what, and so we have to have the apparatus to lock them up. If you think that that's true, your mind is not going to be changed. But I don't think that most of us think that way. I think most of us have some very basic understanding that the circumstances that we're born into, the opportunities that we have, shape our lives and shape our behaviors and shape our trajectories and paths through the world. It doesn't mean that there aren't some incorrigible people. There certainly are. And it doesn't mean there aren't some people who maybe need to be sequestered because they're a danger to others, okay? I don't know how the best way to do that might be, right? So let's just bracket that for a minute. But that argument always gets used to basically say, well, we have to have police because there are people like that. But are those really the great majority of people? Or even close to a small minority of people? I mean, I drive through East New York almost every day, which is one of the poorest zip codes in New York City, and sends the most people to to New York State prisons. And what I see in that neighborhood is absolute utter neglect, terrible infrastructure, terrible housing, very few amenities, very few stores, very few shops, very little economic development. How could that still be true in a city that's as rich as New York City? Lots of patrol cars. Lots of patrol cars. Do you think the patrol cars are actually keeping the people of that neighborhood safe? No, what they're there to is to keep the people of that neighborhood in that neighborhood. Right? And there's no effort then to actually do anything for those people. And that's kind of what I mean about how policing has evolved into this institution that kind of treats our own citizens as an enemy population. James Baldwin in the 1960s called Harlem occupied territory. You can go and read that essay. It's one of the great essays by Baldwin. It's a long-standing problem, right? And it has had these racial dimensions, but it's not just a racial question. It's really about places that have been abandoned, places that have been socially neglected, right? Anyway, I'll stop there for a minute. So that's, I guess, how I would begin. And I think actually a conversation can be generated from there, even from people who believe in police and security, because most people would like opportunities for more social development rather than less, I think. Yeah. And I've had success with this argument with people in the corrections field who basically see that people in prison are not irredeemable. Many of them want opportunity, many of them want education, many of them want a life after prison that is different from the life that got them into prison.
Hi, my name is Josh, and we actually earlier today had a speaker from Israel who would talk about like from the Holocaust up to like the modern era, and then you mentioned the current situation in Israel and Gaza and Palestine. And so basically, I'm going to ask the same question that I kind of asked way earlier. And I know that it's like, that's very different from policing versus like a straight up war. But basically, I asked him if you were given like you personally were given basically complete control over the situation that's happening in Israel. And you have this incredibly divided, like two peoples, the Israelis and the Palestinians, actively fighting each other. What kind of steps could you, do you envision taking to try and, foster peace between those two populations? Because there's clearly...
Yeah. Okay, you've asked, pretty much the hardest question on the planet
I know,
right now. Yes. What steps would I take? I think it's a very good example of the failure over decades and decades to think about just peace, what a just peace would look like. If you know something about the history of Israel and Palestine, you know that the creation of the State of Israel began with mass expulsion of Palestinians who had lived in villages in that part of the world for many, many decades and generations before. It's not that there weren't also Jewish people who had lived in Palestine or had ancestral claims that brought them back to Palestine. So this is not a wholesale rejection of the idea that this could be a land for Jewish people. But it begins with an act of terrible violence that many nation states, especially ones that were formed by settlement and indigenous dispossession, have at their origins. Now, one of the questions is what do you do with that violence from the origin? How do you get beyond it? How do you actually move to a point where you can achieve something like a just peace from these originary acts of horrific violence? Nobody has a very good answer to that question. We still have that question in the United States, actually. One of the things that happens in the United States is, of course, that these this unfolds over a much longer period of time, and people forget, or people are so badly defeated that they no longer ask for things, right? They go to the reservation and they live out life generation after generation in some kind of sequestered place. Although we've been living in a period in the United States of indigenous resurgence, and so movements for land back, movements that are actually demanding some kind of redress, movements that are going back to old treaties that were broken, are actually part of the landscape of contemporary US politics. It's probably very much on the margins of what most of you have thought about or encountered, but it's happening and it's out there. I think that these kinds of foundational questions of historical injustice that are at the origins of many nation states are actually crucial for us to investigate and remember and find mechanisms to figure out modes of reconciliation. So in South Africa, they've had Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. In Central America, they've had Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to try to bring forward testimony, historical knowledge, kind of public recognition of different litigants and their claims, right? Obviously, in Israel-Palestine, the solution has to be some kind of coexistence of the some 9 million people who define themselves as Jews and the some 9 million people who define themselves as Palestinian, all in this one space that's about the size of New Jersey, right? So somebody's got to figure that out. And it can't be through another round of ethnic cleansing, expulsion, incarceration, sequester, whatever. What was happening in Gaza for the last 17 years, where it was essentially a kind of fenced-in, blockaded kind of enclave until the breakout of the Hamas fighters that led to this terrible series of events that we're now experiencing. But all of that kind of can be traced back to an earlier episode of violence, all the way back to 1948, right? So again, do you keep just playing this script forward, and is the Israeli endgame eventually the kind of elimination or the Palestinian acceptance of full subjugation? If that's the endgame, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for the Israelis, right? Because that's just not going to happen. We see it even in the United States after 200 years, this question is still a live question. It's not going to go away. There's a very famous essay called What is a Nation by a French writer named Ernst Renan, and he says, nations are best thought of as entities that thrive by forgetting, right? And the reason he said that is because he wants people to forget the violence that is at the origins of the nation state and the ways nation states were formed. What we realize, I think what we've come to realize but never really figured out how to deal with is that way does not work. That actually we have to engage in acts of remembrance. We have to engage in acts of reconciliation that consciously try to figure out how to heal the breaches, right, that have occurred. But there's a lot of investment politically in not doing that, right? So, and I think we're really at risk, even in this country now, in sort of re-tearing at these same seams, these kind of old racial wounds, these old wounds that kind of divide and define people as alien to one another, right? So I don't have a good solution. I can't really answer your question. I can only dance around it in the way that I just did to sort of give you a sense of where I would come down. That somebody has to start talking in this language of reconciliation, of peoples who have grown up with so much enmity, hatred between them, right? But that will take a political movement. It will take a political movement on actually both sides of the question.
Thank you.
So, you're welcome.
Maybe I'll ask a question, and I'm just struck that our students are quieter than usual, and you've referenced 1968 a lot, so I'm thinking as you did that around here it may be apocryphal, but say in 68 and there are around one Clarence Thomas, then a much more radical student was among his peers who were trying to maybe burn down what's now the Millard Arts Center, then the ROTC building, and there was a whole generation of activism. There was something much more serious. We've certainly come to a moment when people don't know what to do with a quiet response to it, which may or may not be better than a sort of simple performative activism, which I see some other places. But is that merely just to say that in 68 young guys were going to get trucked off to the war, so they fought it. Is that too simple, or do you think there's something more culturally insidious about it that makes us not know how to respond to this long series of events? At least in '68, people felt like they were at the beginning of something different,
Yeah.
but now we've lived with it.
Yeah, that's also such a good question, and it's such a hard one to answer. I mean, I do think if you were all being drafted into a war right now, you would be pretty mad. You know, you would ask questions. You would ask much harder questions. There clearly was a conscious decision after the Vietnam War to essentially make the military service make less demands on the public, right? To turn it into a voluntary military, but also increasingly into a contract military, like a military where a lot of military services are outsourced. And even what I was describing here with the Hmong and the ways the Hmong were conscripted into the U.S. military and the way the U.S. has conscripted various kind of subject populations as kind of contractors and military workers, you know, that's also a part of the kind of military work that now happens that spares Americans from the idea that they are even really involved, right? So there's a kind of wall that's been set up that I think has actually done that sort of work that makes this different. But at the same time, I do think of your generation, the generation of students here, that you actually have a lot more in common in some ways with the '68 generation than any other generation of students I've ever met before. You know, because I think, you know, the Port Huron Statement, which was 1962, which was kind of one of these launching points of the student movement, was, you know, a bunch of relatively affluent students like going to college, and if you go back and read that, I don't know if you probably read that in some classes. You know, I try to remember exactly what I'm not great at sort of the recalling from memory. Maybe somebody else can, but it basically is like, this generation of affluent students who have grown up in kind of like this sort of a world of comfort and kind of middle class wealth, right? Now look on the world we've inherited with great disquiet and discomfort and anxiety because we see what's happening. We see war, we see environmental destruction, we see racism, we see police violence. They list all the things that we're still concerned about, especially this young generation that has in some cases, you know, done some performative activism around some of these things, but in other cases has actually tried to think about how to, you know, organize, how to make a difference, how to make change. I think we also live in a time in which our ability to imagine how we make change has become very, you know, very unsettled. Like it's really unclear. Do you go on Twitter? Do you like go on Facebook? Do you just issue a slogan? Do you just kind of engage in kind of acts of moral outrage and declaration? I think we've lost something about the kind of imagination of how to organize for change. So I think that has to be rebuilt, reconstituted, recreated. I really think that social media plays a very problematic role in the ecosystem of how we get good information and learn to act on it. I think it absorbs our attention. When you think about it, we're giving our attention. We're giving away our attention for free to people who are making billions and billions of dollars off of it and sucking it into the councils of Silicon Valley and their narrow corridors of wealth and power, where they then, you know, innovate new technologies to capture more of our attention, more of our dollars. Like, this is not a good situation. It might feel good in a certain way, in a certain moment, but it is not a good situation. The world has way too many problems that you all are going to have to solve, right? And it's not that technology will play no role in it, including information technology, but the way our kind of current society has become organized into these incredibly wealthy enclaves that have a tremendous amount of influence over what we can even know has got to be broken in some way. It's got to be broken. And, you know, the funny thing is like, this is probably something that like people on the left and people on the right actually agree on, you know, in many ways. But we have this kind of inability to break through some of the log jams in our political structure, which is actually so beholden to all of these dollars, not just Silicon Valley dollars, right, but the dollars of the, you know, the fossil fuel industries and so forth, which are also, you know, tremendously sort of strangling our capacity to make the kinds of changes that we need to make in the way we organize energy. There's a very good book that just came out about how capitalism will not solve the environmental crisis. One of the reasons capitalism will not solve the environmental crisis is because it's not going to be that profitable to really have very cheap renewable energy. It's not going to be profitable. It's actually going to be better for human beings, but it won't be that profitable. So who wants to invest in it? We're kind of at that stage in the history of capitalism where the people that own the most wealth are actually trying to figure out how to extract the most from us in these kind of waning days, not to develop anything that actually widens the ambit of human flourishing, right? So the challenge to figure out how to widen the ambit of human flourishing is a lot of what in some ways has motivated this work that I was doing in this paper and that you've been thinking about in this class. Because obviously, you know, preparing, funding, spending time imagining and thinking about war is not doing that, right? So, I don't know. It's an attempt to think that the spirit of '68 maybe is something that exists, but the conditions are very different for what we need to be doing now.
Anyway, thank you, Professor Singh, for being here.
Thank you.